When justice went wrong. The murder everyone tried to forget. Don't miss out on more true crime stories. Hit subscribe, like, share, and join the conversation in the comments. The cell was silent except for the faint hum of the lights above. 16-year-old George Stinney Jr. sat alone, his feet barely touching the cold concrete floor. His hands shook as the guards entered, tall men in uniforms, faces expressionless, voices low but firm. "It's time," one of them said. The boy looked up, eyes wide and frightened. Outside, the sun hadn't even risen. Inside, a child was about to face a fate no child ever should. Moments later, George was led into a small room with a wooden chair bolted to the floor. A hood, thick leather straps, and a buzzing machine waited for him. The witnesses shifted uncomfortably. Some couldn't look. Others just stared. The chair had been made for a grown man, and George was so small that books had to be stacked beneath him just so his head could reach the straps. The warden gave the signal. Electricity filled the air. The lights flickered. Then silence. Just like that, it was over. But what if it wasn't justice? What if the truth had been buried under fear, lies, and the color of a boy's skin? That question would haunt South Carolina for decades. It would take 70 long years before the world began to ask what really happened to George Stinney Jr. Now, let's go back to where it all began, to the spring of 1944 in the small mill town of Alcolu, South Carolina. It was a quiet place divided by railroad tracks. White families lived on one side, black families on the other. George was just a regular kid. He liked drawing, reading comics, and playing with his younger siblings. His father worked at the lumber mill. His mother cooked meals for the local church. One afternoon, two white girls, 11-year-old Betty June Vinegar and 8-year-old Mary Emma Thames, rode their bikes through the neighborhood looking for wildflowers. They stopped near the Stinney home and asked George and his sister if they knew where to find some. That was the last time anyone saw the girls alive. By evening, the town was in panic. A search began, and hours later, the girls' bodies were discovered near a ditch. Without proper investigation, suspicion immediately fell on George. He was just 14 then, but the sheriff and his deputies wasted no time. They took him away from his home without a warrant, without his parents, without a lawyer. No one saw him for hours. When the sheriff returned, he claimed George had confessed. No written statement, no witness, just their word. His family was forced to leave town under threat. The trial that followed would last only a few hours. The jury was all white. The defense called no witnesses. The verdict came back in 10 minutes. Guilty. And with that, George Stinney Jr., a boy barely 5 feet tall, was sentenced to die in the electric chair. The town moved on. The papers stopped writing. And for 70 years, silence covered the truth. But in 2014, one woman opened the old case files and noticed something that changed everything: a missing document, a false confession, and a lie that could no longer stay buried. 70 years had passed since the day George Stinney Jr. was executed, but for attorney Stephen Mackenzie and Judge Carmen Mullen, the case felt like it had just happened yesterday. It started when a South Carolina historian discovered inconsistencies in the original records, things that didn't add up. No written confession. No transcript of George's questioning. No defense witnesses. Just a single piece of paper claiming a 14-year-old boy had confessed to a double murder. In 2013, rumors began to circulate around the small town of Alcolu once again. Families who had lived there for generations whispered about the boy they killed too soon. Reporters came, asking old residents what they remembered. Some said George was kind, quiet, and couldn't have hurt anyone. Others insisted he was guilty, repeating the same rumors passed down for decades. But when investigators dug deeper, they found what many feared. The entire case had been built on air. No physical evidence tied George to the crime. The girls' bicycles, the murder weapon, even fingerprints, nothing linked him. The confession? It was never signed. And worse, it had likely been forced out of him after hours of isolation and intimidation. There had been no lawyer, no parents, no witness in the room. For a child barely in his teens, the fear alone could make anyone say anything just to go home. George's surviving siblings, now elderly, began to speak publicly for the first time. His sister, Amy Ruffner, recalled the moment the police took him away. "He was just a kid," she said softly, tears filling her eyes. "They said they just wanted to talk. But he never came back." She remembered her brother as shy and gentle, a boy who would rather help her with homework than pick a fight. By late 2013, pressure began to build for the case to be reopened. Civil rights lawyers, journalists, and activists called it a crime against justice. When Judge Carmen Mullen finally agreed to a hearing, the courtroom was packed. The air felt heavy with history. Cameras clicked. Reporters leaned forward. The defense presented the old evidence, or rather, the lack of it. They showed how George's defense attorney, appointed by the court, did almost nothing to protect him. There was no cross-examination, no appeal. The entire trial, from start to finish, had lasted less than 3 hours. As Judge Mullen listened, her face stayed calm, but her eyes told a different story: disbelief, sorrow, and anger. Then came the moment that froze everyone. The original trial transcript mentioned that the confession had been obtained verbally, but there was no record of how. When asked if George's words were recorded, the sheriff at the time had simply said, "No need," he admitted it. Outside the courthouse, the crowd waited in silence. The same courthouse where a frightened boy had been sentenced to die now stood as a place of reckoning. Inside, Judge Mullen took a deep breath before speaking. "This court finds that the 1944 trial was a fundamental injustice," she said. But before she could deliver her full judgment, one final question surfaced, something that would make everyone in the room pause and wonder if the truth had been lost forever. If George didn't do it, who really did? The courtroom was silent, the kind of silence that presses against your chest and makes it hard to breathe. Everyone stared at Judge Carmen Mullen as she shuffled the papers in front of her. Then, slowly, she spoke the words that had been buried for 70 years. "This court overturns the conviction of George Stinney Jr. For a moment, no one moved. And then, quiet gasps, tears, and a few muffled sobs filled the room. George's surviving family members held hands tightly, their faces trembling with both grief and relief. Justice, though late, had finally arrived. News spread across the nation within hours. Wrongful execution overturned after 70 years. The headlines read. Major networks replayed the black and white photo of George, a thin, scared boy in an oversized prison uniform, standing between two officers nearly twice his size. Americans were stunned. Many couldn't believe that a child had been executed without a fair trial. Others saw it as a painful reminder of the dark corners of the country's history, a story that had been hidden in plain sight. Reporters flooded Al-Kolu, trying to understand how such an injustice could have happened. Some residents still refused to talk, afraid to stir up the past. But others came forward with memories that made the truth even clearer. An elderly man recalled seeing George that day, saying he looked confused but calm, nowhere near the place where the girls had been found. Another local woman admitted that back then, the community's fear and prejudice were stronger than reason. They needed someone to blame, she said quietly. And George was the easiest target. Meanwhile, new research into the original case revealed that key evidence had been ignored. Investigators at the time had failed to follow up on other suspects, including adult men known to wander near the area where the girls were found. But in 1944, no one had cared to look further. The color of George's skin had sealed his fate long before the trial began. Civil rights groups across the country hailed the decision as a landmark victory. "This case reminds us that justice delayed is justice denied," one activist said during a televised rally. The ruling didn't bring George back, but it forced the nation to confront its own past, to see how easily justice could go wrong when fear and bias ruled the system. Even today, George Stinney's story continues to echo. Schools teach it. Documentaries tell it. Artists paint murals of his face, not as a criminal, but as a symbol of lost innocence. His name now stands for more than a tragedy. It stands for the promise of change. As the sun set over Al-Kolu, George's family visited the small, unmarked grave where he was buried. They placed flowers, white lilies, and stood in silence. "He's finally free," his sister whispered. The wind moved gently through the trees, carrying her words away. But one question still lingered in the air, unanswered after all these years. If justice could go so wrong once, how many others were forgotten too?